Is it 2 years since the book was published?
Yes, July,
Yes.
wasn't it? 2009.
Anyway, it's
yeah.
rather nice to be meeting up again so we can talk about it.
Indeed,
I'm
yes.
beginning to get a bit rusty about one or two things.
Oh, I'm sure you remember
And
more than
no,
I
but
do.
something you were very much concerned in was folk singing and chapter 16, which is the pastimes for the men.
Yes, yes, indeed, yes. I've always been involved with, well, if it's not sport, it's folk music. And of course, as you know, I ran the sessions at the Oyster for 20 years, over 20 years actually.
That was in that inner room, wasn't it? That was only open on Sunday
yes,
evenings.
in fact, when I first went to the Oyster, it was open, before I actually moved to Buckley, it was open this particular time for a party for an American who was going back to the States, I think it was. And the people, the old boys in the village said, "Well, we haven't been in here for years," they said. So that
was Vera, the old landlady, who was very set in her ways.
That's right,
she?
yes. But she did allow us to go in there when the numbers attending the sing-arounds reached more than 40, because you could hardly squeeze those into the so-called men's kitchen, which was a small
And of course,
bar.
in the corner was the piano, which you weren't allowed to play.
Well, I was allowed to sit on it. I could rest one buttock on it. Just
Closed, I hope.
yes. So yes, that was where the person who chaired the sing-arounds could make his authority felt.
Yes. How many local people were regular singers in Buckley?
It depends how you define local, really, but within 10 miles around, I mean, I suppose not all at the same time, but there must be at least 20 performances. Usually a good dozen each time. It's difficult to fit everyone in for 2 songs.
What I especially appreciated, because I was digging in Borough Hill and I used to bring students in who loved to see what was happening. What I most enjoyed was really the way you conducted proceedings. I think you were called the chairman, that was a traditional name, and you used to invite people to sing and then suggest who would follow. You would keep a sort of balance.
Well, that was the aim, and the idea of being a chairman was derived from Wickets Richardson of Blaxall Ship, who used to use a cribbage board to bang on the table to get good order. But they were so well behaved at Buckley, I didn't have to do that.
But even so, tempers can get a bit frayed, can't they? I've heard an old tape of people at the Ship, and they're quite grumpy, the really old ones. And they seem to be fussy about which song, who's singing which song.
That was certainly an issue in the old days, shall we say, but we modern people didn't insist on,
But people didn't sing someone else's song, did they?
They tended not to, no.
Or certainly if they were there.
No, that'd be even more.
Yes. Because I've got a friend called Stephen, and you know him, but he's known by everybody as Tom because of his song.
He used to sing Tom Bolan, was the song he sang as his...
Yes, and I expect there are other examples of that.
Well, I can't put the top of my head into it, I'm sure there are. Oh, I was known as Whaley Fish, because I used to sing a song about the Whaley Fish.
Well, there you go.
But never to my face, I only discovered it after years. Anyway, there we go.
And I recall that you organised a gathering of people coming from a great distance in Blaxall Village Hall when the Ship was no longer used for singing.
Well, that all originated back in 1974. There was a record made by Topic, I think it was, in Blaxall Ship called The Larks They Sang Melodious, and I had one song on that. And a friend of mine, got in touch with me in 2004 and said, "What about a reunion?" But of course, many of the people had either moved away or died, and all the older singers are gone. But we did try to use all the songs that had been sung on that original recording on this reunion, and of course you actually recorded some of them.
Well, that was a coincidence really, because unfortunately I asked everybody through you if they minded if I recorded it, and I had the smallest little recorder.
But
and then thanks to my friend Chris Farmer, who edited it, we made a CD to raise money for the village hall, which was brilliant. So that still exists as a record of the singing.
Yes, indeed, yes. Now, we first met, of course, again, I mentioned 1974, it must have been about that time, I should think, when I lived in Buckley and you came to Borough Hill.
That was 78 when I came to Borough Hill to dig.
All right,
so
that's
you'll
what
have to look at your diary.
Not closely.
Yes.
Well, you've got to say a bit about how you came to be doing that.
Yes, it seems a long time ago. But I came to Borough Hill because I was working in the British Museum on research on the Sutton Hoo ship burial for the 3 great volumes that we've now got to be the definitive publication of every object in
Has
the
that
30.
been superseded at all yet? Or,
It never will be
No, that
superseded
was
as
it.
the definitive
No,
record.
yeah.
And it was a lifetime's work for my boss, Rupert Bruce Mitford.
Mm.
And he delegated to me sort of objects which were particularly exciting in his eyes. And one of them was the cauldron chain, which was a mass of totally corroded ironwork.
Yes.
And there was no free metal left. And I had 2 years hard labour really working out how it was built and using radiographs which come full size. And so everything was drawn out full size. And the day came when I could draw out all the components. And I got a very large sheet of tracing paper, and then it went on and on and on, and it transpired it's the longest cauldron chain known.
What sort of length did it be?
Yes, I can't remember that. I'd have to supply that bit of information. It just will not stick. But what I do remember is the length of the little chain that was found on Barrow Hill. And the reason I visited Barrow Hill was because I was looking for other chains in the area, and I was writing up the chainwork chapter.
Yes.
And nobody knew anything about Barrow Hill chainwork, which had been found by a ploughman in the 60s. And it was in bits in Ipswich Museum. By that time I'd studied enough cauldron chains to know how it should fit together, and then found an old drawing which was actually in the British Museum. It had been posted by the curator of the British Museum, so it was among the correspondence, showing how it was when it was found, so that confirmed the order. And there's a drawing of that in the sort of little article I did on the site, so you can see that shows you the fragments as they were in the museum. And this is how it's been put together. And that's about 6 feet long.
And there's in fact a replica, isn't there, in the Ipswich Museum now?
Yes. And what people do not, I think, on the whole appreciate is what adjustable implements they were. Because you can see we've got hooks, we've got a big ring at the top with a swivel, so that the cauldron hanging on the bottom of the pot could rotate, it didn't sort of catch. And then you've got hooks on which things could be lifted up, so you could lift up the hooks out of the way if you weren't cooking, or you could shorten the chain below the hooks. You could hang pokers or ladles on the hooks. And of course in those days you didn't have a roaring log fire, you cooked with little bundles of faggots, so you had a very adjustable amount of heat. And cauldrons have got quite thin skins, and cauldrons are very thin, the walls of cauldrons, and of course they would burn out in no time at all if people did cook them over a log fire. So what one finds with Anglo-Saxon cooking is it's all very slow cooking, unlike Irish peasant cooking.
Right. That is slow food didn't start recently, did it?
And of course it depends on the fuel that you have. And peat, of course, which is used in Ireland very extensively, is also available in Buckley. If you think about all the low ground, we have medieval records of people having, digging peat. So one can think that would be used as well as faggots to cook. So there was evidence on the top of Barrow Hill for an Anglo-Saxon hall.
Yes, indeed.
The question was, where was
it?
And I started digging to try to find it.
And of course, much of the hill had been dug away for gravel digging.
That was a sad.
But so I can actually tell a little story about that, because one of the men who had an allotment next to me when I lived in Buckley was telling me how when he came home from the First World War for leave, the old roadman who used to maintain the roads before tarmac and so on, he used to get gravel from Barrow Hill. He said, "Then buggers up in Barrow Hill sent me down some more skulls," he said.
Really?
And because there were all those burials that were found up there, weren't there? Well, 4 of them ended up in the bank by the old bullock yard, top of Oyster Hill.
And if you think about it, there will be human bone under most of the roads on the estate,
because
they went up there for loads of gravel. Yes. But of course, by the time I came to dig there, nearly all the top of the hill had been dug away. So we were only digging around the very rim of what had been a very important Anglo-Saxon. Yes, well, it was a settlement site and a cemetery. And I think one can say a church as well was there. if for no other reason than because we've got that tiny piece of red
Stained
glass.
glass, yes.
Yes. Now we've come from a church window.
Yes, in those days.
It all seems a very long time ago now.
Are you talking about Anglo-Saxon or us?
Something else? Do you know what really started it all? Our writing the book. It was a coin.
Oh,
A coin about as big as my fat fingernail
yeah.
that I found with the team on Barrow Hill at the end of one season
Mm-hmm.
and you weren't there. And of
No.
course, when you find coins on Barrow Hill, you keep pretty quiet about them. And this coin was the only one of its type known. It still is the only one
Right.
known
Yeah.
of a king of East Anglia whose only mention is in the writings of a monk, a Durham monk in the 13th century.
Mm-hmm.
And so this coin was so special. Obviously, we didn't tell people, and I suppose I should apologise at this late stage that I didn't immediately get in touch with you.
I'm very upset, of course. But,
So when you
but of course I
did
didn't
discover
Mm.
from a lecture you went
Yes.
to, you quite rightly wanted to know a bit more about
What
it.
haven't I been told in the last 20 years, sort of thing?
Yes.
And of course it was about, well, it was just before the year 2000, I suppose,
Yes.
which was the year I retired, although I did carry on working part-time for a company for another 2 years and got involved with a voluntary organisation as well.
Yes.
But anyway, that's
And
all.
of course, you're also living in Woodbridge, so
And I was now in Woodbridge, yes.
So you went
Not
to
that I
sort of-
hadn't kept up my interest
No,
in
no.
Butley, of course.
but
Yes.
not so easy to call in on.
No, no.
Indeed.
So,
And if you remember, it was almost accidental. You'd been doing history of your house and some research
oh
into
yes,
the
yes.
village history of Butley, hadn't you?
Yes,
And
I've
it-
been on a course actually back in 1986, I think it was, that got me really inspired. Yes, I had looked into the history of the house, which I had actually been able to discover relatively easily. I thought, oh, this history business, there's nothing to it really. And to
Yes.
discover that, of course, there's a lot more to it.
Yes, because at an earlier stage of the research, you'd said, I think after about 6 months, you said, well, you can go on doing research forever, I think we should write it now. And I was sort of feeling there were so many holes that we hadn't really got to first base. But then at that stage, I think you were thinking of something quite modest.
Yes.
And I was quite keen that we did something which really put the history of this forgotten peninsula on the map.
Yes.
And because we did find it very difficult to fill in some of the periods, didn't we? The 18th century.
18th century was the hardest, really.
It was one of the worst.
Mm.
And we decided to cut out the really early things. It was just a mention of Barrow Hill incidentally. So we didn't plod through the thing in a sort of simply chronological style. Well, in fact, we didn't have a book plan. We wrote topics, didn't
Yes, yes.
and again, you were a bit concerned. And I said, oh, it'll fit itself
Yeah,
together
yeah.
eventually.
And of course we had to, well, I mean, the fact, of course, that you were living near Southampton and I was here in Suffolk for most of the time, well, nearly all the time,
Yes,
wasn't it?
yes.
It wasn't so easy to get together, but of course we did meet at the National Archives on occasions. And of course, I mean, an example of how material gets spread around, I mean, the memorial records for Butley were in Ipswich Record Office, Bury St Edmunds Record Office, and the British Library. We went there as well, didn't we?
Yes,
So
yes.
they were in those 3 different locations.
Yes, yes. And then, of course, you're never quite sure when something will turn out to be really important to shed light.
Yeah.
You wade through large vellum documents, legal gobbledygook, hoping there's going to be one little clause
gem,
buried
yes.
somewhere in there, talking in a tiny whisper because you can't speak in the record office and you're trying to help each other through.
Well, I think it was the National Archives at the worst. I could hear the frog in my throat as I was,
Yes.
and you were tapping onto the laptop as I was sort of saying,
That's right, and we had sessions doing this. And when you put in a ticket for something, you're never quite sure if it's going to be a small book
No.
or one of these enormous things arriving on a trolley.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we put in, do you remember, for the case of arson between,
Oh
was
yes.
it Punt?
Punt and Denny. Punt and
Denny
Denny.
and
Arson.
Punt.
It was
So we
in
thought,
Butley, wasn't it?
yes, and it was a And that was a case that had been brought to the King's Court in Westminster, hadn't it? So we were expecting a trolley to arrive. And it was a single sheet of paper.
And it wasn't really arson, well, it could have been arson, but it was all to do with finding of silver, which has almost certainly come from Buckingham Priory, and been stolen. It was 1540, just after the dissolution, wasn't it, the closure of it. And this Kent house was on fire, I presume it was the thatch, and in the thatch they found this silver that's almost certainly been stolen. And that was really the reason this deposition
had reached the king.
Nothing
to do with arson,
no,
it was a little shed that burned down,
yes.
But it was what was in it. And we'd always been mystified that when the commissioners came to make an inventory of Buckley Priory, they said there was nothing in it
except cattle and lead and cattle, wasn't it?
Yes. So we
and all the
wanted to know
silver
where
gone.
the silver had gone. Of course, some monastic houses smuggled it abroad, didn't they, to the parent houses?
Yes.
But this is fascinating.
And of course, it was the ex-warrener, well, he probably still was a warrener, but the man who had been a warrener at the Priory at the time of the dissolution was one of the deponents, one of the people who was telling the story of how they were out bat fowling. And do you remember the fun about bat fowling?
Well, neither of us, we both sort of tried to guess what bat fowling could be, and you typed it up on your
computer, no,
PC.
And
yes, spell check or something,
well,
which accepted
it. Yes, it threw me completely. So I then had to look in the Oxford Dictionary and discovered it was not fouling bats as we thought, but batting fowls. In other words, knocking them off their perches in the night.
Yes.
And catching them in the net.
So
the warreners'
they
net.
were poaching, weren't
they? Were poaching. Well, either poaching or it was with permission of the landowner. It's just possible, I suppose. But anyway, I don't know. That's guesswork, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. So then gradually we started to compile, as you say, these sort of chapters. Yes. Well, they weren't chapters at that stage. They were just subjects. Subject.
Of course, if you haven't got a body of information ready, you don't quite know where your research is going to take you. So you can't really create an entity as a subject. And another wonderful thing was that letter from Elizabeth IV.
Oh yes, in Norwich record.
Another single sheet of paper.
Yes, indeed, which they've got catalogued as a 17th century, I think it was, or 18th century letter, but they had no idea what it was about. And we were able to say, well, actually, it was written in May 1593 from London to
one of our key characters, the very tragic story of the fourth heir who made this disastrous marriage to a Catholic girl who'd written the letter.
Yes, to her sister in Norfolk. Yeah.
Most of the documents we have are sort of official in some form or another, so they're sort of edited or slanted if lawyers are found. But that was, she was pouring out her heart to her sister, so that was really moving.
Yes.
Do you remember a local historian who lived in Woodbridge, George Arnott?
I know of him. I never met him though, did you?
Yes, I met him with my boss in the British Museum, Rupert Bruce Mitford. George had a garden party in his little walled garden, which was just near the Market Square in Woodbridge.
I know where that is, yes.
And of course, Rupert was treated almost like visiting royalty or the Pope, and he was, all kinds of people bought sherds they found in Mohenjo-Daro or wherever for a pronouncement from the great man. That was my meeting of George Arnott, and of course he was immensely knowledgeable. And he and his father, who were estate agents and auctioneers, I think that was their business, had access to house clearances and sales through the years. And so he'd been able to collect a large number of documents. And he wrote 3 small, wonderful books.
The All History. One's called the
All.
Yes, anyway, the 3 main rivers, wasn't it? The Orr, the Devon, and the Orr.
And the reason they're so good is not only did he have the historical knowledge, but he was a sailor. So the one I first read was about Burrow Hill, naturally. So it was about the river.
Yes.
And he had anchored just under the cliffs of Gedgrave, looked at Burrow Hill. So it was a really lovely implication of it. Yes. But something he said in that book was the idea, he mentioned the idea that Carlton in Doomsday could have been located at Chillisford. And of course in the survey, one of the entries for the Carlton Manor is next to the Chillisford entry, and George obviously realised that. And then he picked up the Carlton Place name, which was attached to the mill what we now know as Buckley Mills, plural,
Yes.
was at one point had 3 names,
Yes.
didn't it?
Yes. Alias Buckley, alias Chisford, alias
Carlton.
Carlton. Yes.
And of course now, looking back after all our work, I think you can see how it came to have this funny mixture of names, because it was the conflation of what had been 3 separate mills once.
Yes.
And the third mill we identified as coming from the south of the parish because of an old, well, an 18th century map, which had Carlton and Mill place names on a stream which ran down from Capel Green and ran along Stonebridge, across the marsh. And of course, when the river walls were built and the rivers that drained that valley, the streams rather than rivers, were all organised and rationalised, that particular mill and the stream disappeared and were no longer needed. So the Carlton Mill, the name, was relocated up to the main outlet, the north, the Buckley Run.
End of the estuary.
And then we had a boundary dispute with the relocation of the mill, because there was something like 75 feet of land which had once been Buckley's land moved into Chillersford land, because they moved the mill to another outlet just down. And that's in the court records.
Yes, indeed.
And that's wonderful. They got very cross about this. And so they took a big stone and a cart and planted it there. So there was, every now and then, there's a lovely insight into village life.
And of course, the other manor that I don't think is entirely located, the exact location in the Suffolk version of the Domesday Book, the Suffolk translation, was the Laneborough manor, which
there are 2 volumes, aren't there? And we've got a map here which is very tiny with numbers on, but Laneborough is put way out in somewhere in Hoasley.
Right. And again, we were able to, again from an old document, wasn't it? A 14th century document, is it here?
Yes.
Able to say, well, it's part of what is now Boyton Parish. In fact, it's near what's called Scotland Fen these days.
When you look at the parish map of Boyton, you can get a very good idea of where Laneborough was, because there's a funny bulge in what is now Scotland Fen, another problem of a place name. Yes. And we found the reason for Scotland Fen was various local people were convinced it related to a time of great poverty when Scotsmen drove their cattle down and took poor land and grazed. And we were able to identify a Duchess's gamekeeper, Scottish gamekeeper.
Yes, moving the posts out on the heathland, where of course there's no distinguishing features really out there, were there? Except a little mound called the Spy, that shepherds would climb to be able to find their sheep deep on the heath, hidden by gorse bushes and so on.
It was in our difficult 18th century period.
And and it was a Scottish gamekeeper who came down and tried to filch a few acres for the Duchess from whoever it was. I can't remember quite who it was now, but anyway, to filch these.
It was the Boyton, was it not the Boyton
Trustees? The Boyton
Trustees,
that's right, the Almshouse Trustees.
Which is why the records survived, because of course they were very careful in keeping accounts and transactions. So one can imagine the Boyton people getting very cross about this, Scottish gamekeeper, and calling it Little Scotland. He's made Little Boyton.
Little Scotland. Yes.
Something that is important to mention is the way this book is trying to appeal to a great many different people with different levels of interest. We were very keen that the villagers and local people would find it interesting.
Yes.
And judging by their reactions, they do, and some of them say, I keep it by my bed, or I will never find it something that I can't find of interest. Every page has got something of interest, that sort of thing they say.
Yes.
And then we wanted it to be useful for people who were doing local research.
Yes.
So we've mentioned a lot of the local people who are involved in different activities, and there's a good index for that. And then we really wanted it to be an academic book, which of course it doesn't appear to be, and the title doesn't help with Untold Tales, sounds a bit...
Yes.
But Untold Tales is really...
It draws other people in there, doesn't it?
Well, we're really saying this is unpublished, otherwise unpublished
Yes.
historical research.
Research, yes.
And at the back, if you can flick through to find where we've written in small print, haven't we, the reference and the documentary
Oh, yes.
details of everything. We've got different kinds of bibliographies. We've got a glossary, and then these, every page has the sources for what we have written.
Yes.
And I think in that we have been really obsessively careful to give a really good working tool for anyone serious historian.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that would be...
And that, of course, is something I suspect academics haven't picked up on yet.
No, maybe not. I mean, that was the most difficult, apart from some of the Latin I will look at first, it did rely entirely on you. But that's one of the hardest things to decide where to pitch the book, really, who was the readership.
Yes.
And you could easily fall between two stools, or you could become obsessively for the general reader and especially for the historian. But I have
again,
one or
if you
two
flip
people.
again, yes.
One or two people have said that we've done very well. Historians have said we've done very well to, balance it in that way.
Yes, but we've used boxes, haven't we? So we've enabled people either to focus on something. I mean, here's pipes. So some people found pipes in their garden, so they look at that.
Yes.
Or it's been some quite difficult area, which is to explain something in the story without interrupting the narrative.
Flow sort of thing, yes.
And then, of course, at the beginning of the chapter, which I have to say, I had this idea I picked up from a wonderful American academic now, David Lyle Casson. He's written a marvellous book on ships and seamanship in the ancient Mediterranean.
Yes.
And he's had this larger print first page telling you what's in the chapter. So, and then it gradually gets smaller print as he gets to the more academic footnotes.
Oh, I see.
Which means you can get to things very, very easily.
And of course, that was another issue. Do you have footnotes or do you put them at the end? And I find
put off by footnotes.
Well, I think I would
interrupts the read.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Well, I'll tell you something quite interesting. I've just seen the name Joseph Arch here.
Yes.
Who was the founder of the Agricultural Workers' Union back in the 1870s, and he actually came to Buckley when the big strike was on. In 1876, I think it was, and he took tea at the Oyster Inn because he was a Methodist and therefore was a teetotaler, and he addressed the labourers in Woodbridge, where they used to congregate and march around the town saying, "No tyranny," and there's that lovely expression where one of them described, "We come marching in like soldiers, but we go home like a flock of sheep." And that was quoted, I think, in the Times, because it was a Times correspondent who wrote up about the other. Anyway, when I was having a rambling holiday just earlier this year, I went to a village called Barford in Warwickshire, and I knew Joseph Arch came from Warwickshire, and there's a pub there called the Joseph Arch Inn, or pub.
Well, I hope you didn't just have tea in it.
No, it was a happy hour. I actually enjoyed the happy hour for a few minutes. I was only just in time for that. And of course, he was born in the village and died in the village, and his house is still there, almost opposite the hotel that we were staying. Isn't that incredible?
Yes. Lovely. Presumably, you knew more than any of your colleagues
about
all this.
That's the trouble. You see, I guess the previous year, I'm really digressing now, but when we went near Swindon, I was telling him about the fritillary meadows there. I think Harriet knows everything, but of course he doesn't.
And of course, getting illustrations.
That was
Yes, I know you didn't really think illustrations were.
Well, no,
I know your children have
sort
of informed you that they are.
I didn't know how far and wide you were prepared to travel and get permissions to reproduce them.
Yes, some were very difficult, but it was lovely to try to find the odd picture of a local person which told a story.
Yes.
And this one I'm particularly fond of, Louis Reeve, because local people told me about her as an old woman. And there was this lovely photograph of her in her uniform as a forestry, I don't know what her term was, but she was employed along with a team of young women to plant the forest, which was such a feature of the landscape before the great storm.
Yes, yes.
And it was just harrowed by a horse, and then these girls planted by hand these thousands of saplings.
Yeah.
And she's got a badge, you see, in her hat, and huge pockets. Probably she kept her lunch in there. My goodness.
Yes, yes.
And this is a lovely one, isn't it? This picture of Claude Reed with his tractor.
Yes, he's had to give up farming now.
Yes,
so
yes, his
dead.
dead.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's and of course it does cover really pretty well from what the tail end of the Priory. We didn't deal with the Priory in great detail, partly because I suppose it's
When you said we didn't repeating, I thought it was jolly important that we didn't just repeat already published information. We were trying, because that would have unbalanced the book from the start, and it's been well published. And the local historians brought it all together in a neat booklet recently, so in a way that freed us not to do that.
Not have to do that.
And to concentrate on the personalities.
Yeah.
And particularly that difficult period of the dissolution, to see how much continuity there was with the staff and what happened to work.
And of course the wonderful thing was the list of all the people who were at the Priory on the day it was closed.
Yes.
With all their trades, like you said, the Warrener earlier.
Yes. And on a serious level, it was good to examine the difference in agricultural practices or not between the monastic organisation and the capitalist farming entrepreneurs, and to look at the effect on this particular area, which quite often doesn't fit the sort of broad brush, I suppose, generalisations. I don't know what the analyses of people who are looking historically on a bigger scale.
Yes.
I think the Sandlings probably don't fit some of the patterns. For instance, we don't have nuclear villages for the most part.
No,
they're
very
scattered.
aren't they?
And people always assume, local people, that was
Must
the
be
plague, and not understanding this represents an earlier pattern, tenure. So,
and also, of course, the other thing that it was a revelation to me, really, because I always thought that the heathland was virtually uncultivatable until recent years when irrigation was introduced. But in fact, there were periods when they were planted with arable crops, or parts, large parts, weren't they? Yes.
Something else we looked at was woodland, and see just how little of it was wooded. And I found this hard to understand when I thought in the past of the importance of timber at every level. For fuel, tools, carts, houses, great demand. And then you look that we didn't have enclosure acts here because the land had been enclosed centuries before for the most part, apart from the big sheep walks.
Yes.
And so the plots tend to be about an acre because that's what is easily ploughed within. Is it for one team? I'm trying to remember.
Must be a day.
Day.
Otherwise, we didn't have the job properly.
That depends on the soil, doesn't it?
Well, of course.
And of course, the hedges round the fields all had trees growing in them. So this was in lieu of woodland. You had your timber supply was round your fields.
Yes.
And we haven't. You've got Staverton as an old woodland, which of course was a park, but not a deer park for the greater part of his life.
No.
We think right at the beginning it probably was, and it is now because the Kembles
got deer in there. Yes.
But it was a huge resource for pasture and for forage in bad weather. Sheep were kept alive on holly branches, the ones that grow high up without prickles were cut. And of course it was used
I found one particular will where he talks about his wethers, which are sheep, aren't they? Male sheep, I think. In Staverton Park, and his bullock in there or something like that. Anyway, certainly part of it, probably the part that was not, where most of the trees had been removed at some stage, or perhaps were never there, I don't know, but within the park perimeter, animals were kept. Copy holders who keep their animals there, almost like a common, I suppose, in a way, though perhaps they only leased it or something like that, rather than have common rights, but we don't, that's a detail we don't know.
And of course, you look at the northern map, you can see that Staverton Park, which is beautifully portrayed, he doesn't show an even spread of trees. There are areas which are untreed, and then stripped down the side, which is cultivated.
Yes.
And then there are the sort of tiny woodlands which exist in the Priory. I think I worked out the proportion. It's a very small proportion that is wooded. And Little Haywood over between Haple and Boyton is really the oldest wood we've got. The one that people think that is so old, which is the one by the Priory, which is now called Waterwood,
Yes.
in the past was called Ashholt Wood, exactly the same size at the dissolution as it is today, but was described as an indifferent plantation, in other words, not a natural wood, but it had been coppiced ash, because it's Ashholt, which would have been tremendously valuable. It's most valuable wood for fire and for tools, and it's close to the Priory's yard where all these activities took place.
Yes, and of course where the daffodils grow, and
Yes.
which Richard Mabey featured in his radio programme
Yes.
this year.
And of course they spread all across that valley, don't they? Up into what is now
Oakwood.
Oakwood.
Yes.
Which used to be called Waterwood, and when you walk in it you can see why. There are springs up there which make it permanently damp.
Well, which was the other wood? The Bell
Goodwin's. That was in private hands, that wasn't the manorial part of the wood, and if you look at it you can see it's coppice. Whereas the Great Wood, as it was called, when it wasn't called Waterwood or Oakwood, has got a few oak trees, big oaks, but if you look at them, they're all stunted or twisted. There's something wrong.
Yes.
And that's because Walter, gosh, what was he called, beginning B? Walter Boynton.
The man who
Boynton.
Boynton in the 20s.
Walter Boynton
1920s.
in the 20s bought this large part of the estate for next to nothing. And he bought it with his wife's railway money, because they lived at Melton
Grange.
Yes. And he was stuck for cash, and so he ripped out all the trees, and he used machine chains to drag them out. And so he took out all the trees of inequality from that wood, and the ones that are left are the ones that weren't any useful and no value. And that's why the tracks are so deeply rutted. It's a result of Walter's activities.
Yes, he did a lot of damage, didn't he?
Yes. Well, one finds these cycles of prosperity and depression that have an appalling effect on local people.
Yes.
Dearth and plenty, I think. Did we call it that at some point?
I just wonder about our list of people at the Priory. Anything there that, any other, because we've got the Warren, was it?
We broke them down differently, didn't we? Do the children separately. I remember I thought it was no point in just reproducing it as everybody reproduced it. We
that's
broke it down
alphabetical,
differently,
yes. Yes, it was
which helps you to see if you've got any relatives there.
Yes, the children are listed somewhere. But I was thinking, yes, I think I did a huge amount of work on transcribing wills, and several of the people who actually were listed as part of the household of the Priory, in other words, the lay people who worked on the farm, and there were nearly 70 of them, I believe, and we're talking about 5,000 acres, but a lot of it would be heathland, of course, and not a lot of labour needed for it. Yes, what I found with all the wills, and there's been several hundred I think I must have transcribed, is that it's often more interesting, or there are little bits that appear on the original will that don't appear on the copy that was made for the ecclesiastical court, because all the wills had to be the probate had to be granted by an ecclesiastical court. And sometimes there was a little bit added at the bottom that they wouldn't transcribe because it wasn't necessary. And one of them I particularly liked was one of the canons at the Priory had written this will, well, for a man who had died, but his widow was being referred to, when he put a note at the bottom addressed to a Mr. Sent, who I presume was one of the ecclesiastical officers, and saying, please be kind to this poor woman, meaning the widow, because this is the first will I have ever written. And so he was worried that he hadn't written it in such legal terms that would enable her to be the proper beneficiary of her deceased husband's will. And then there was another case, around about 1540, where someone wrote that at the end of the will that he was riding past this house in Hoseley, where a man lay dying, and he said to him, "You ought to get so-and-so to witness your will, and don't forget, in effect, to surrender your copyhold to me, because it was the manorial lord of Wantiston who actually was writing it. So there were again little insights into how things worked, really. I mean, I've often wondered with wills how they managed to be, most of them, very well written, really, especially some of those that were written in Latin. They must have been rehearsed in advance, it seems to me.
Yes. Or the scrivener, who is fluent in Latin, is taking the instructions from the ill person and actually writing it in a form in which the author,
witnesses,
nobody can actually read it.
No. I can't picture that happening, because I did read one will where they actually said it was rehearsed before, whatever, the priest, I suppose it was. And I just wonder whether, in fact, it was sort of like notes were taken and then it was written out, and then it was, unless of course it was desperate and the person was on the point of death and this was not possible.
But
when you think really long wills, there's no way you would take it down at the time, I don't think, because the person who is dying is going to be much more rambling in there. Oh, and so-and-so must leave so-and-so to so-and-so.
But of course that brings us to another point. Sometimes people made their wills long before they die, when they are all right. Yes. And of course it's always a danger for me to think, oh, the will date is the death date, and then to have to find, long search to find.
And even the probate can take 4 or 5 years because it's been disputed. So there's all these little nuances that you need to be aware of, and traps, I suppose you could say.
Yes.